in New York, while others traveled by barge to railroad stations in Hoboken, New Jersey, or in Jersey City, on their way to destinations across the country. Now let's really get into the nitty-gritty and talk about what it was like to be processed through Ellis Island. When you went through the different stages, what was it like? Who would you meet when you went through? Who are some notable people in history who worked in Ellis Island? And other information. So let's start out from the European side. When Europeans left their home, a passenger manifest document written in script was created from the point of departure, whether Italy or the Ottoman Empire, Ireland, wherever. And this manifesto included each passenger's name, age, occupation, destination, and other information. Ellis Island accepted its first new arrivals on New Year's Day, 1892. The steamship Nevada arrived with 124 passengers on board. The first immigrant to set foot on the island was Annie Moore, a teenager from County Cork, Ireland, who'd crossed the Atlantic with her 11 and 7-year-old brother en route to reuniting with her family in New York. A U.S. Treasury Department official and a Catholic chaplain were on hand to welcome Moore, and Ellis Island's commissioner gave her a $10 gold piece to mark the occasion. Most immigrants enter the United States through New York Harbor. Ellis Island was the main port, but I should mention that there were other destinations, including Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Savannah, Miami, and New Orleans. Typically, the ship that you would get on to go to Ellis Island and these other places were great steamship companies like White Star, Red Star, Cunard, and Hamburg America. Depending on where you were in the ship, this made a big difference on how you were processed through Ellis Island. First and second class passengers who arrived in New York did not have to undergo the inspection process. Instead, these passengers went through a cursory inspection aboard the ship, and the idea was that if you could afford this passage, then you were less likely to become a public charge and become a financial burden on the United States for medical reasons or legal reasons or mental health reasons. The federal government thought that these more affluent passengers wouldn't end up in institutions or hospitals or become a burden to the state or America's safety net, which was pretty rickety at this point in history. So first and second class passengers were sent to Ellis Island for further inspection if they were sick or had legal problems. You basically had to be flagged if you were in this crew. But if you were in the steerage or third class, then the situation was much different. These immigrants traveled in crowded and unsanitary conditions near the bottom of steamships. They had few amenities. They spent weeks seasick in their bunks due to the rough crossings. Around the turn of the century, crooked immigration officials were known to take bribes of $1 to $2 in exchange for letting immigrants get off in Manhattan without first going through inspection at Ellis Island. Once they arrived in New York, ships would dock at the Hudson or East River piers. First and second class passengers disembarked, passed through customs at their piers, and were free to enter the United States. The third class passengers were transported from the pier by ferry or barge to Ellis Island, where everyone would undergo a medical and legal inspection. Well, the first person you met wasn't actually a legal inspector. It was typically an interpreter. These interpreters spoke multiple languages, and they would help guide them through the process of immigration. The interpreters were invaluable because they helped get immigrants into America. Without their help, many immigrants would have been turned away and deported. The average interpreter spoke 6 languages, and some spoke as many as 12. There's one individual who's recorded speaking 15 languages. Now, probably the most famous person who worked as an interpreter at Ellis Island was Fiorello LaGuardia. If you don't recognize the name, then you at least recognize the last name because that's an airport in New York. Well, that's named after a longtime and famous mayor in New York. He served for multiple terms, and he's from Italian background. He was the son of an Italian father and a Jewish mother from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he worked as a clerk at the American consulate in Budapest and was a consular agent for emigration at the port of Fiume in Croatia. Then he returned to New York to study law at night school. During the day, he worked as an interpreter at Ellis Island. From 1907 to 1910, LaGuardia worked at Ellis Island and was an interpreter certified for Italian, German, Yiddish, and Croatian. So He developed skills that made him a really good mayor because he knew how to work with many different groups of people, and he saw firsthand what it was like to arrive in New York from places all over the world. In February 1910, Ellis Island's commissioner, William Williams, wrote, "Mr. LaGuardia is energetic, intelligent, and familiar with a number of foreign languages. Against him, there may be said that he is inclined to be peppery. That with some of the board of special inquiry members, he is inclined to be argumentative, but it is not a defect of the first order. I think his abilities place him at the higher grade of interpreters." Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. After leaving Ellis Island, LaGuardia became a lawyer and eventually entered politics as a progressive Republican, and I mean that in the early 20th century sense, like a Teddy Roosevelt. He served as a U.S. congressman from 1917 to 1919, and then again in the 1920s and early 1930s. He was a popular 3-term mayor of New York from 1934 to 1946. So that was one of the famous people there. But where did you go after you met your interpreter who would guide you through the process and he would speak to you in whatever language that he needed to communicate to you in? One of the first places that people would go to was the quarantine checkpoint off the coast of Staten Island. Doctors would look for dangerous diseases like smallpox, yellow fever, plague, cholera, or leprosy. And they had reasons to be concerned because many people who were leaving Europe were leaving disease-ravaged areas. Maybe they were coming from villages. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this is one of the more dangerous times in history for infectious diseases because bacteriology is still in its infancy. Public health is not nearly as advanced as it'd be in the 20th century. But you have higher populations living in closer quarters than they ever have before. And when you have lots of people packed together in close areas without great sanitation, that is just begging for the outbreak of diseases like this to happen. So doctors had to be very careful that they weren't importing these types of diseases anyway. So once the ship passed inspection, then immigration officers began boarding the ship via rope ladders. They had to start immigration procedures really fast because there were so many people coming through, sometimes 2,000 to 3,000 passengers from all classes, and you could have as many as 1,500 in third class alone. Now, keep in mind there were no passports or visas needed to enter the United States at this time. There were no papers required at all. This was a paperless period. You just had the ship manifesto with everyone's name written on it. But if you wanted to give a fictional account and start a completely new identity entering the United States, then this was your chance. All you really had to do was verbally give information to the official when you boarded a ship in Europe, and that information was the only one that they used when they arrived. So if you were a career criminal or a wanted murderer, this is a great way to hit the reset button. I should also note here, before we get too far into the medical inspection, that sometimes children arrived alone. Children arrived on Ellis Island either with their parents or without. Some were orphans and received sponsorship from charities and other groups from Europe. Employees who worked at Ellis Island tried to make the place welcoming for children, and some spent weeks or months in limbo while they were waiting for entry into America. Maybe they were waiting for family to come to claim them or just to make sure that they were healthy. Around 1900, recognizing all the children coming into the United States, officials built a playground to entertain the kids. The island also employed matrons that would play games with and sing songs to children, even though many of them didn't speak the same language. Red Cross donated a radio for children, and eventually a classroom was installed to begin teaching them English. When it came time to disembark, steerage passengers, who were given manifest tags so inspectors could find their information, were confronted by U.S. Customs officers that would check bags for goods or contraband. Small steamships would then bring passengers to Ellis Island, and the boats would carry 700 to 1,000 passengers. The passengers would be ordered to form 2 lines, one for women and children, including boys under the age of 15, and one for men. The first thing that happened was a medical examination. They were performed by military surgeons and dressed as military men, which confused immigrants who thought that they might be policemen or soldiers. But whatever their confusion, they had to work quickly because the doctors had to examine everyone as quickly as possible for eye disease, heart disease, skin disorders, and more. In 1884, President Chester Arthur issued a proclamation allowing the government to quarantine people entering the U.S. to prevent the spread of pestilence due to concerns over tuberculosis. Immigrants were detained because they didn't have immediate family members to meet them at other times or didn't have the financial means to settle in the United States. But only a very small percentage were deported due to health reasons or other issues. The doctors also had to know a few words of instruction in many, many different languages. And this was tricky because most immigrants were illiterate even in their own languages. By 1907, the doctors developed a secret code system using a piece of chalk. They'd mark the passengers' clothes with a letter of the alphabet. H indicated heart trouble, X suspected feeble-mindedness, L for lameness, and so on. Those marked were removed from the line and taken to a room where they could be locked up, called the doctor's pen, sort of like a pen or a cage practically, until the doctors were free to continue further examinations or questionings after the massive influx of thousands of people into Ellis Island at once. About 10% of people were detained for this kind of questioning, but 90% got through without any problems. Doctors knew that there wasn't enough space to detain too many people, so you really had to be pretty sick to be able to be detained. Interestingly enough, deaf people were often rejected because they would be considered financial burdens on society. There's an account of a deaf Jewish girl named Nellie Ratner who left Vienna in 1938 after the Nazis rose to power. She, her mother Hilda, and her deaf sister traveled to the United States from Italy, but they wound up spending 5 months on Ellis Island because immigration officials feared they'd be financially dependent on the government. A woman named Tanya Nash, who worked for the New York Society of the Deaf, advocated for the family and told the judge that the deaf could be very independent. Her efforts didn't work, but the family ended up receiving a $2,500 bond from Jewish philanthropists. Ratner later recalled, "This is money to support us if we couldn't work or something." So then, later, they did finally let us go. We were so happy to leave. When we got out, my mother and uncle worked, saved, paid back the money. It took 5 years. The money was all paid off finally. $2,500 in 5 years. They both worked so hard. Ratner's uncle eventually found them a place to live in the Bronx, and they later moved to Brooklyn and then Manhattan. One disease that doctors singled people out for was called trachoma, which caused blindness but could also kill. About 50% of the people who were detained on Ellis Island had this disease, and usually they were deported. Josephine Garzieri was 15 when she arrived on Ellis Island from Italy with her father and brother. She had trachoma, so she was quarantined in the medical wing until deportation. Her father found out he needed a $1,000 bond for her treatment or else she'd be deported, so he asked strangers for a loan. He was able to raise enough money to pay for her treatment. Garzieri was then placed in a special section of the hospital for people who had trachoma and spent 11 and a half months there. She later recalled, "They just take you there and take your clothes off and give you clothes that belong to the hospital. So you have identification, you can't run away." And no one tried to run away because we had nowhere to go. We had a guard with a gun in the front of the building and in the back of the building, so we made no attempts to run away. She received daily treatments and wasn't allowed to walk because this would have created too much heat on her eyelids and stopped the healing process. Now let's say you pass the medical examination. Well, you're not finished yet because after that you have to answer 29 questions on various topics like polygamy, anarchy, and the U.S. Constitution to pass then. When immigrants arrived at Ellis Island, they were funneled through a line in the Great Hall. In addition to medical examinations, they spent several hours answering questions. Immigrants were filtered in lines to be interviewed by inspectors, often with the help of interpreters. The inspector would verify the passenger manifest by rereading the information provided. If everything was okay, the inspector would make a check by your name, but if the answers were wrong or suspicious, then an X was marked there and you were told you'd be detained. The U.S. immigrant inspector's job was to conduct face-to-face interviews with all immigrants in a proceeding known as immigrant inspection. Every foreigner that entered the port of New York was questioned, whether on board the ship or at Ellis Island itself. Some of these questions included, "Are you meeting a relative here in America? Who? Have you been in a prison, almshouse, or institution for care of the insane? Are you a polygamist? Are you an anarchist?" The last one sounds a little bit odd, but keep in mind that anarchists were responsible for some of the most high-profile assassinations in the late 19th and early 20th century, including U.S. President William McKinley. This was considered one of the most dangerous ideological groups out there. They also started World War I, or at least helped trigger it with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So this was the group that they were most on the hunt for. It was worse than being a member of ISIS or Al-Qaeda in the 21st century. Other questions from inspectors included, are you coming to America for a job?